Good morning, Life Church. I'm glad that you're with us this morning. As Matt said, we're in the Gospel of Mark. We're going to be in chapter 7 this morning. And so if you have a Bible with you, I really hope you do. I'd love it if you would turn there and just wait for me for a few minutes. I'll come meet you in Mark 7 this morning. We're in verses 1 through 23. I'll start today by just chatting with you a little bit about my oldest son. His name is Hudson. Hudson is 16, close to 17. He's a sophomore in high school this year. And I'll put it on the table. I could not be prouder of the young man that he has become than I am. And I think he's really, really a special young man. I know I'm biased in these things. And I also know that Hudson would say, were he standing here, that he is, just like you and just like me, a sinner in need of a Savior. But still, he's just marked by character and godliness in some ways that are really, really sweet for me to see. But one of my favorite stories about Hudson, it's one that kind of gives you a glimpse into who he is and how he thinks. It comes from when he was just 9 years old and in the third grade. When Hudson was in the third grade, the school that he attended, they had every class elect a class representative to serve on the school council for the school. Now, I don't really know what a third grade school council member does. Like, I'm unsure about that job description, but that's what was happening in Hudson's third grade class. And he came home from school one day and he told his mom, my wife, and I that he wanted to run for student council. And frankly, we were surprised by that because H was then and still is kind of on the quiet and reserved side. But we were supportive of the fact that he wanted to run. We were also, frankly, just a little bit nervous, maybe even terrified. You see, our children are growing up in a world in which no one keeps score in youth sports, right? But everybody gets a trophy for participating. Right, like the world we live in, it wants to tell everyone that they're special, and it wants to protect everyone's fragile feelings. And so we were very aware of the fact that my third grade son was entering into this election, having really never participated in anything that had a real winner and a real loser. And in this election, there was going to be one winner and then probably a bunch of losers. And we just weren't really sure how our son would take it if he was, when he was, the loser of this election. And so we had a little bit of apprehension about it, but we supported Hudson nonetheless. And I recall, again, third grade Hudson, he worked really hard and prepared really well for that election. Right? He kept his campaign clean. He didn't run any attack ads. His stump speech, it was concise and on point. Something about getting rid of the off-brand crayons and markers in the class art supplies, I believe. And the day of the election came, and Kristen and I, we were total messes about it, but he was confident, he was ready. His speech was well practiced. Hudson wore his favorite Under Armour shirt to school that day. He even combed his hair, which was a rarity for third grade Hudson. He went to school, he made his speech, and he lost the election. In the end, he took that disappointment way better than his parents did, by the way. But I remember, here's the thing that I wanted to tell you. That night, I was talking to him, as he was in his bed getting ready to go to sleep for the evening, and I was just asking him how he felt. And he told me, Dad, I'm disappointed, but I'm also happy because the person that I voted for won. To which I replied, you mean you didn't vote for yourself? And he said, oh no, I didn't think that would be the honest thing to do. And I said, what do you mean, the honest thing? And he said, well, I really wanted to be on the student council, but I knew that my friend would do a really good job. And I remember just hugging my son and wiping the tears from my eyes and walking out of his room, trying to change the subject as fast as I could. Because of course I knew, and you've already realized, that Hudson blew any chance he had of winning this election by not voting for himself, right? In elementary school student council, there are 19 people running. And so if you don't vote for yourself, you are definitely going to lose. But the more I thought about it later, the more I realized that I think there was something right about Hudson's thought process. You see, on some level, we all live with this awareness that we don't measure up. Right? We live with this awareness that deep inside, we're deficient or we are inadequate. We know that that's true about ourselves. We know that if we were to be examined, and I mean like truly examined, that if the truth about who we are deep inside was to be revealed, that if everything we've ever done or thought or felt or desired, if those things were suddenly exposed before all people, right, we all know that we would be considered failures. Right? That's why we have such a deep and nagging sense that we must conceal who we really are. We must hide our true selves. And we might use social media to do that. We might use success in business or in school to do that. We might use fancy clothes or bulging biceps to do that. We might use fancy, expensive cars or nice homes to do that. We might even use religion to do that. But all of us, we fill our lives with these things that conceal our deficiencies. We fill our lives with things that hide who we truly are. We do everything we can to kind of manage other people's opinion of us because secretly, deep inside, we know that we don't measure up. We know that we are deficient or inadequate or, and I'll choose this word from our passage today, unclean. That's why Hudson's statement at age 9 made so much sense. Right, aware of his own uncleanness, he thought it would be dishonest to choose himself over his friend. Now, what he didn't realize is that his friend was just as unclean as he was, of course. But Hudson knew himself. He knew what we all know deep inside. We don't measure up. I wonder how you deal with your feelings of inadequacy. I wonder what you do with that nagging sense that you are not enough. For a lot of us, there are times when those feelings just crescendo and we can't deal with them. And so we lose ourselves in Netflix or in mindless scrolling or in a bottle of something. Most of the time, we deal with our feelings of deficiency simply by finding something, really anything, that allows us to look down on other people. Right? If we're in the grocery store and there's a toddler melting down in the mom's grocery cart, we think, well, at least I've taught my kids better than that. If we see a coworker who always slips into the office 10 minutes late, we think, at least I have my act together more than that person does. If we're driving to church on Sunday morning and we see our neighbor loading up his boat for the day, ready to go out onto the lake, we think, at least my priorities are more in order than his is. Right? We know that we're not perfect. We know deep inside that we're inadequate, but we cope with that and we deal with that by pointing out ways that we are superior to other people, at least superficially, at least in our own eyes. That's how we deal with just this nagging, plaguing sense that we're deficient, that we're inadequate, that we are unclean. Well, since the start of the year, we've been walking through the Gospel of Mark, and today in Mark chapter 7, Jesus, he deals with the very root of why we feel inadequate. He deals with the very root of why we feel unclean. And then he exposes and just destroys all of the superficial ways that we attempt to cope with that inadequacy. And so as we read this passage today, I'll just point out like how it's kind of put together. You'll notice that Jesus, he interacts with three separate groups of people. So first, he's going to interact with the Pharisees. Second, he's going to interact with the crowds. And then finally, with his disciples. And so you can kind of track through three separate but related conversations here. Pharisees, crowds, disciples. Let's see what the Lord has for us in the story. I'm just going to read small chunks at a time because it's kind of a longer passage. So I'll read a little bit at a time, and then I'll pause and unpack things for us. Let's start in verse 1. This is Mark 7, 1 through 23. Mark tells us, now, when the Pharisees gathered to him, to Jesus, with some of the scribes who had come from Jerusalem, they saw that some of his disciples, Jesus' disciples, ate with hands that were defiled, that is, unwashed. So the Pharisees and the scribes, this is like the Jewish religious establishment, right? These are the elites in the Jewish religion at the time of Jesus. And what Mark is telling us that here in Capernaum, where Jesus is hanging out, like a bunch of these guys have come from Jerusalem, which is a journey of about 90 miles. Why have they made this long trip from Jerusalem to Capernaum? Well, it's because they have an agenda, right? They have a motive here, and that is they want to find out if Jesus is going to trip up and say something or do something that violates their law. And so they kind of come to him with that agenda. They want to see if they can trap Jesus into saying something that they can later hold against him. But the first thing they notice when they arrive is not something that Jesus is doing. They notice that Jesus' disciples, well, they're not washing their hands before dinner. They're not washing their hands. Now, to be clear, just in case you weren't sure, the issue here is not hygiene. Right? We're not talking about sanitation here. This is thousands of years before anything like modern germ theory. The issue with the disciples not washing their hands is that leaves them ceremonially unclean, which was a really big deal in Jesus' day. And Mark explains that that's a big deal to the Pharisees most of all. Look at how he says that in verses 3 and 4. He says, "For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands properly." Again, that's not about hygiene. It's about ceremonial cleanliness. How do they do that? Holding to the tradition of the elders. And when they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash. And there are many other traditions that they observe, such as the washing of cups and pots and copper vessels and dining couches. And so Mark tells us that there are a bunch of traditions that the Pharisees and all the Jews maintain in order to make sure that they are clean. Now, when we think about these traditions that Mark's talking about, we should understand that these traditions are separate from and in addition to the Old Testament law, what we might call the law of Moses that you find in the first 5 books of the Old Testament. The law of Moses regulated, it was given by God to regulate how God and his people were to relate to one another, how they were to live in relationship with one another, how God's people were to be distinct from the outside world. And so the law, because it's given by God, was good and something that Jesus would wholeheartedly uphold throughout his life. But the tradition that Mark describes here is something different altogether. It's something that's separate from and beyond that law. And it was a long list of commandments that the Jews came up with, and they called it a fence around the law. And what they mean by that is that it was extra commandments that helped the Jews make sure that they were not living in violation of God's law. But the simple thing about this is that it became just like really, really excessive. So let me give you some examples of this distinction between the law and the traditions around the law. And so the fourth of the 10 commandments says this: remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Right? So that's the law. That's something that God has declared. And from the beginning of their history, the Jewish people have understood that they were not to work on the Sabbath. Rather, they were to remember the Sabbath, to keep the Sabbath holy. And so they were to rest and devote themselves to worship on the Sabbath because God's law required that of them. But the tradition of the Jews put a big fence around that law, stipulating the kinds of things that you can and cannot do on the Sabbath. For example, according to the tradition, like it was unlawful to look at yourself in the mirror on the Sabbath, because if you looked at yourself in the mirror, you might realize that you had a gray hair, and you might be tempted to pluck that gray hair out of your head, which would be work, right? That would be a violation of the law, the Jews believed. And so tradition said, don't look in a mirror on the Sabbath. According to tradition, you couldn't carry anything on the Sabbath. And so the Jews, they then asked, well, what kind of traditions do we need to establish to make sure that people aren't unlawfully carrying things on the Sabbath? And I'm not making this example up, by the way. This is like directly from the Mishnah, which is this book of Jewish tradition. For example, if you needed to blow your nose on the Sabbath and you had left your handkerchief behind, like let's say it was upstairs in your bedroom, well, you had to be really careful according to tradition. Because it was lawful, according to tradition, to walk up the stairs of your house and take your handkerchief and blow your nose, Or it was lawful to walk up the stairs of your house and take your handkerchief and put it on and then go back downstairs and then take it off and blow your nose. But what you absolutely could not do, according to tradition, was walk upstairs, pick up your handkerchief, carry your handkerchief downstairs, and then blow your nose, because that clearly would be a violation of the law. Right? It seems excessive, doesn't it? Like it seems like they're like nitpicking quite a bit. And this is just what Jewish tradition did. Now, the vast majority of that Jewish tradition, it pertained to the issue that Mark is talking about here, and that is ceremonial cleanness and uncleanness. And that's the issue that the Pharisees had with Jesus and with his disciples. Basically, in the time of Jesus, the Jews were always cleansing themselves and their stuff, right? Their clothes, the dishes they ate with, everything. Before you ate, before you prayed, you had to wash all the time. And especially if you went to market where you were very likely to, interact with someone who was unclean, like a Gentile, then when you came back to your house, you had to cleanse everything before you were to eat or to pray or anything like that. And so the Jews were excessive about this. There's historical documentation of one Jewish rabbi who was excommunicated from his synagogue. Right? Think about a pastor like fired from his church simply because he forgot to cleanse. He forgot to wash his hands once before praying before a meal. Josephus, who's a Jewish historian, he tells a story about a Jewish rabbi who was imprisoned in Rome, and he actually died of dehydration because in prison, when the prison guards would bring him water, he wouldn't drink it. He would use it for cleansing, and so he died. Right? This is how serious the Jews were about this tradition. But the question we have to ask ourselves is, why did they develop all of this tradition in the first place? What were they really trying to accomplish? Why did they work so hard to build this fence around the wall? Well, the answer is this is how they dealt with their feelings of inadequacy. This is how they processed and responded to the fact that they felt unclean. But the Jews knew that they fell short spiritually. They knew that they didn't really measure up to God's standards, and so they built this religious and moral tradition that allowed them to feel superior to other people. Right? The Pharisees thought, we may not be perfect, but at least we keep the tradition of the elders. We may not be perfect, but at least we're not like those Gentiles. We may not be perfect, but at least we're not like Jesus and his disciples who don't even wash their hands before dinner. And so when the Pharisees see Jesus' disciples not washing their hands, this is a big deal to them. They call Jesus out. Look at verse 5. And the Pharisees and the scribes asked him, why do your disciples not walk according to the tradition of the elders, but eat with defiled hands? And do you hear the tone? Right? They don't say, like, why do these people not wash their hands? They say to Jesus, why do your disciples? Right? You hear that? That's an accusation, right? Why are your disciples ignoring the tradition of the elders? Listen to Jesus' response, verse 6. And he said to them, well did Isaiah prophesy of you hypocrites, as it is written, this people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. You leave the commandment of God and hold to the tradition of men. This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. What Jesus is really saying there is that the Pharisees' solution to their uncleanness, to their inadequacy, to their deficiency, it had a fundamental and fatal flaw. Their solution was superficial. It was only skin deep. Right? They thought they could deal with their sin through better performance. But what Jesus knows and what he teaches in this passage is that sin, it's ultimately always a matter of the heart. Right? That it is therefore possible to do good things from bad motives. That it's possible even to worship God in hypocrisy, honoring him with lips, with a heart that remains very far from him. Church, that should make us tremble, shouldn't it? Because this means that it is possible to sound and look and seem very, very pious, very, very spiritual, very, very religious, all while remaining very far from God in your heart. In other words, you and I, we can roll in here on a Sunday morning, Caleb on the radio dial in the car on your way here. Right? You can lift your hands during the slow songs. You can pull out your Bible with your 9 highlighters and take notes during the sermon. You can drop a check in the offering box on your way out the door. And you can do all of that. I can do all of that with a heart that persists in wicked rebellion against our Creator. Let us never, ever think that we are smarter than the guys that Jesus is rebuking here. Right? In fact, the second that we think, man, at least I'm not like those Pharisees, and that's the temptation, right? Let's be honest, that's the temptation. We're reading about these guys and we're like, man, why in the world are they so obsessed with these cleansings? Why are they so obsessed with washing their hands before dinner? We all know that that's not really a thing, right? We all know that it's the heart that counts. And so we're tempted to think right here, right now, at least I'm not like those Pharisees. But the moment we do that is the moment we are exactly like them. Right? The moment that we do that, we've put ourselves up and put them down. We've looked to something that we are doing in our worship that makes our worship much more sincere and much more pious than the worship of the Pharisees. And so we should tremble before God, lest we too would be people who would honor him with our lips, even while our hearts are far from him. And what Jesus knows, and that Mark is ultimately teaching us here, is that the issue is our sin, and our sin is not a skin-deep problem, right? And so it cannot be solved by skin-deep solutions. Skin-deep obedience, it can mask, but it will never cure sinful hearts, right? Solutions that are surface level will never be capable of dealing with what is broken inside. And that's the point that Mark is just driving home for us. Now, in this passage, Jesus gives an example of how the Pharisees are doing that. He does that in verses 9 through 13. And I'll be honest, this is a little bit thick. So let me read it, and I'll try to explain it as best as I can. Look at verse 9 with me. This is the example of the Pharisees worshiping God with their lips while their hearts are far from him. And he said to them, "You have a fine way of rejecting the commandment of God in order to establish your tradition. For Moses said, 'Honor your father and mother,' as another commandment, and whoever reviles father or mother must surely die. But you say, 'If a man tells his father or his mother, whatever you would have gained from me is korban,' that is, given to God, then you no longer permit him to do anything for his father or mother, thus making void the word of God by your tradition that you have handed down. And many such things you do." Now, again, I'll forgive you if you got lost in there a little bit. Let me just try to explain here, right? So the law of God, it commanded, honor your father and mother. That's the 5th commandment. But the Jews, through their traditions, they basically found a loophole. It's called korban, which is a Hebrew word that just means dedicated to God. And basically it went like this. If you had a lot of property, let's say you were pretty well off, you had some possessions, you had some scratch in the bank, right? You were doing well in life. If you wanted to hold on to those possessions yourself and to make sure that nobody pressured you into doing something with your money or your property that you didn't really want to do, what you could do as a Jew in the time of Jesus is you could say, well, I'm declaring all of my possessions korban, dedicated to God, which means when I die, God is getting everything. Look at me. Look at how pious I am, right? I'm giving everything that I own to God. But the Jews' practice of korban meant that you could hold on to those things while you were still alive. And what Jesus is pointing out is that some of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law and other people who followed them, they were using this practice of korban to kind of get out of taking care of father and mother. And so when mom and dad are getting up in years and they need to be put into the nursing home, and obviously that's costly then and now, right? Some of the Jews would say, "Sorry, mom and dad, I can't help you." Right? I know I have all of these resources. I know I've got stacks on stacks of cash in the bank, but all of that is korban. It's devoted to God, and so I can't use it for you. And so the Jews were using the tradition as a loophole to kind of wriggle off the hook of the implications of the law. Now, the key words here, Jesus says in verse 13, if you're lost in that whole illustration of Korban, don't worry about it too much, because the key words here, the end of verse 13, when Jesus says, and many such things you do. In other words, this Korban deal is just the tip of the iceberg, right? The Pharisees used tradition to appear faithful, but really they were hypocritical. They used tradition to look good, to mask the fact that inside they were still so far from God and so rebellious against God. Which is why he quotes from Isaiah, this people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. Now let's not lose the forest through the trees here. The big idea that Jesus is driving home, sin, it's never a skin-deep problem. Therefore, it cannot be solved by skin-deep solutions. Right? Sin is not a matter of following rules or not. Sin is a matter of the heart, which means more and more rules can never deal with your sin problem. There is no set of rules or regulations that can ever truly resolve your deficiency or your inadequacy. There is no moral code of conduct that can make you better. There is no tradition that you can follow and no law that you can keep that will truly, authentically make you clean. Because your biggest problem and mine is a heart that is naturally far from God. It's a heart that is sinful and broken. That's what Jesus goes on to reiterate. He says it first to the crowds, and then he brings his disciples in and says it again to them. So let me show you that. First, the crowds, verses 14 and 15. He's accused the scribes and the Pharisees of being hypocrites, and then he called the people to him again and said to them, hear me, all of you. In other words, I don't want anyone to miss this. It's that important. And understand, verse 15, there is nothing outside a person that by going into him can defile him. But the things that come out of a person are what defile him. Nothing that goes in that can make you dirty. Nothing that goes in that can defile you. It's what comes out of you that makes you dirty, that defiles you. And so cleanness and uncleanness, it's not about what you eat. It's not about whether or not you wash. It's about your heart. Then Jesus moves away from the crowds, and he makes the same point in even more detail to his disciples. Look at verse 17. And when he had entered the house and left the people, his disciples asked him about the parable, and he said to them, then are you also without understanding? Do you not see that whatever goes into a person from outside cannot defile him, since it enters not his heart, but his stomach, and is expelled? In the Greek, Jesus is quite graphic here. I'll spare you the details. Thus he declared all foods clean, Mark adds. Verse 20, and he said, what comes out of a person is what defiles him. For from within, out of the heart of man, come evil thoughts, sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, coveting, wickedness, deceit, sensuality, envy, slander, pride, foolishness. All these evil things come from within. And the things that come from within, defile a person. Now, what Jesus says here, it is just absolutely radical. It was radical to the ancient Jews, and it's still radical today. And that's because throughout human history, like the default wiring of the human heart leads us to believe that if we want to be good in the eyes of God or others, then all we need to do is to live right? We just have to live clean. Now, different people in different societies have defined living clean in different ways. And even today in this room, we might have a bunch of different definitions of that. But most of us, we've just kind of assumed this moral code from the culture around us, right? And we think as long as I live according to that moral code, then I'll be clean. right? And so there's this list of things that we think good people do, or list of things that we think good people don't do. And we think as long as we do the things that we're supposed to do and we don't do the things that we're not supposed to do, then even if we fail just a little bit, we'll still feel clean, right? We'll feel like we're basically good. And isn't that all anybody expects, right? Nobody's perfect. So let's just make sure that we avoid the naughty stuff and embrace the good stuff. And as long as like this side of the list outweighs this side of the list, then we'll be okay. But Jesus just demolishes that way of thinking and that way of living. He says, and he declares it so forcefully here, that the root problem is something that cannot be cleaned up by living a good and moral life. Right? Your sin and my sin, that's what makes us feel so inadequate and unclean. And it's not the result of, just the fact that we weren't raised right. It's not the result of the fact that, like, our circumstances were unlucky. Right? Our sin isn't the result of a bad upbringing or a poor educational system. No, my sin, it's the fruit of my sinful heart. And your sin, it's the fruit of yours. And that's why superficial, skin-deep solutions, they don't work. Laws and traditions, they can regulate human behavior, but they cannot fix the human heart. And the human heart is what is broken. Trying to live according to external traditions and laws, right? That's like stapling rose blossoms on a dead rose bush. You might be able to make the plant look good for a hot second, but in the end, no matter how good it looks, the plant is still dead. Tradition and moral codes, they can make you look better on the outside, but they cannot and will not change your heart. What can? Who can? What's the solution to our sinful hearts? If our hearts are the problem, if our hearts produce the evil thoughts and the sexual immorality and everything else that Jesus describes here, right, what can be done? How can we be made clean? As I was studying for our time this morning, over the course of this week, thinking about what Jesus says here and thinking about how what Jesus says here fits into the storyline of the Bible, I was praying about these things, and really there were two Old Testament passages that kept coming to mind. Both of them are kind of obscure. They're from books of the Bible that we don't generally preach from, maybe books of the Bible that we don't generally read very often even. The first was Leviticus chapter 16. Now, I know you probably didn't do your devotions in Leviticus 16 before you came this morning. Leviticus 16, it describes what the Jews called Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. And specifically all of the lengths that the high priest of the Jews would go through on the Day of Atonement. See, the Day of Atonement was the one day per year when one man, the Jewish high priest, would enter into the most holy place in the temple. Maybe you've heard it called the Holy of Holies, right? The place where the Jews understood that the presence of God dwelled most intensely. Only one day per year could one man enter into the most holy place in the temple, and he would do that in order to make a sacrifice of atonement for the sins of all the people. This was like the highest and most significant holy day that the Jews celebrated. And because the Jews rightly understood how holy God was and how fearsome it therefore was to approach the place where his presence dwelled most intensely, the Jews understood that they had to prepare the high priest in order to enter the most holy place. And so for a week beforehand, before the Day of Atonement, the high priest, he would sequester himself or quarantine himself. Right? And people would bring him food, and he wouldn't interact with anybody except for the special people who would bring him food, because the Jews just didn't want to risk the high priest doing anything that might contaminate himself, that might corrupt him, that might make him unclean or defiled. And so he would be off on his own for a week before the Day of Atonement. And then when the Day of Atonement arrived, he would enter the temple, and he would, in the presence of all the people of Israel, take off his clothes, and he would cleanse himself ceremonially. And then he would dress himself in pure white linen and he would go into the holy place and he would make a sacrifice for his own sins. And then, covered in the blood of that sacrifice, he would come out and he would take his clothes off again and cleanse himself a second time and put on another white linen robe, new, fresh, clean linen, and he would go into the most holy place a second time. And he would make a second sacrifice, this time for the sins of all the priests of Israel. And then it would repeat. He would come out from the most holy place and take all of his clothes off a third time and cleanse himself a third time and put on new white linen a third time. And he would go into the most holy place, and then and only then would he make the sacrifice of atonement for all the people's sins. And the key thing about this is that the entire time, everyone's watching, which seems awkward to us, right? Because homeboy's taking off his clothes. But everyone's watching. Why are they watching? Why was this so important to the people of Israel? Well, it's because the high priest on the Day of Atonement, he was dealing with the sins of all the people. And the people, they realized that if he was corrupt in any way, if he was unclean in any way, if there was just a hint of defilement, just a speck of dirt on him, that they needed to stop that and do something about that, lest the high priest be corrupt and therefore his sacrifice of atonement be corrupted. And so he would do everything in front of the people, and they would never, ever let him enter the Holy of Holies if he was like visibly or outwardly defiled in any way. That's Leviticus 16, the Day of Atonement. That sets up the second Old Testament passage that I just thought about again and again this week. This one's probably even more obscure. It's from the 3rd chapter of the Old Testament prophet Zechariah. And in Zechariah, the prophet, he receives like a series of visions. They're called his night visions. And in one of them, the high priest, his name in Zechariah's vision is Joshua. The high priest appears and he's in the presence of God. Zechariah sees him standing, not in the Holy of Holies, but before the throne of God himself in heaven. And Joshua, in this vision, he's dressed as he would be dressed for the Day of Atonement. He's dressed in the linen robes of white. But, and this would have been just shocking to Zechariah, like Joshua's white robes as he stands before the throne of God, they're filthy. Literally, the text says they're covered with excrement. Just filthy and disgusting. Joshua, the high priest, he's in the presence of God, but he's completely and totally defiled. Right? He's unclean in the presence of God. And scholars say, like, the point of the vision is that Zechariah would just be unable to understand how this could happen. Like, he wouldn't be able to believe it. He would have raged. Who let this happen? Right? Who allowed the priest to enter the presence of God while he was unclean? And the scholars say that what is happening is that God's giving Zechariah this prophetic vision to show him how God sees us, how God sees all of us. Because in spite of all of our efforts to be good, in spite of all of our efforts to clean ourselves up and make ourselves moral, in spite of all of our efforts to deal with our deficiency and our inadequacy, right, God, he sees our hearts. And he sees that they are immoral filth. It appears to God as if we are covered in excrement, like we're defiled, like we're unclean, because we are. But then something happens in Zechariah's vision. This is Zechariah 3, verse 4. And the angel of the Lord said to those who were standing before him, standing before the high priest Joshua, "Remove the filthy garments from him." And to Joshua he said, "Behold, I have taken your iniquity away from you, and I will clothe you with pure vestments." Priestly garments that are pure and undefiled in God's eyes. And then just a few verses later, the vision goes on. "Hear now, O Joshua the high priest, I will bring my servant the branch, and I will remove the iniquity of this land in a single day." And church, I want you to think for just a minute about how Zechariah would have heard that. Because for years, his whole life, this prophet had believed that what you do is what makes you clean or unclean. He had devoted himself to the sacrifices and the offerings and the cleansings. For years, he had been dealing with his sin on only a skin-deep level. But now God is promising a new solution, a better solution, a deeper solution, a cure, and one that will come in a single day. And again, Zechariah would have wondered, well, how can this be? And it's through God's servant, the branch. Right, in the Old Testament prophets, those are words that always refer to Messiah, to Jesus, the Christ, the Son of God, the true and better high priest, the one who made himself the ultimate sacrifice, not to deal with the people's sins just once per year, but to deal with the people's sins once and for all time. He appeared centuries after Zechariah's vision, and he staged his own day of atonement. 1 week beforehand, he began to prepare. But what happened to Jesus was opposite of what happened to every other high priest who came before him. Right? Every other high priest of Israel had the whole nation cheering him on and supporting him, wishing him well. But Jesus, right, all of his followers abandoned him as he made his priestly sacrifice. When every other high priest stood before God, he had the support and love of the whole nation of Israel. But when Jesus stood before God as our high priest, he stood alone. Right? He was forsaken by everyone, even his heavenly Father. And instead of being clothed in new linen garments, Jesus was stripped of his clothes. Right? They were sold for pennies by soldiers, and he hung naked on the cross before all people. And instead of being served by people, Jesus, he was mocked by people as he made his priestly sacrifice. Instead of ceremonial washings, where he was bathed in his own blood and in human spit. Why? Well, so that God could clothe us in priestly garments, garments that are eternally clean. Right? God put our excrement-covered garments onto him, and he gave us his pure white linen in its place. But he took our defiled and broken and impure hearts, and he gave us new and whole and pure hearts. He cleansed us. He healed us from the inside out. He took the filthy rags of our unrighteousness, and he made us new. And that's what Jesus has done. He made a whole new way to be clean. And so I ask you this morning, how do you deal with your inadequacy? How do you deal with the persistent, nagging feeling that you don't measure up? How do you deal with the painful and daily reminders that in your own strength you are defiled and unclean? You come to the one, the only one, who can cleanse you completely from the inside out. You come to Jesus. You come humbly, confidently, with joy and with gratitude. You come to him. Jesus, we praise you this morning for the fact that you have not left us to what we can accomplish through laws and traditions. We praise you this morning because you have not forced us to rely on anything that we might do to cleanse ourselves and to make ourselves right and holy and clean. But instead, when we were unclean, when we were defiled, you came and you offered your life for us. We praise you because you are our great high priest who has made a sacrifice once and for all time, that we who were unworthy might be called worthy in heaven forever, that we who were defiled might be made new, that we who were broken might be made whole, that we who by nature lived only for ourselves and were dead in our trespasses and sins, that we might be made alive because of your grace. And we just pray, Lord, that would stir us to come to you in new ways and deeper ways today, to bear before you increasingly the ways that we find that we are just trying to clean ourselves up. And we lay all of our doing before you, God. And we pray that we would rest in what you have done, in the way that you have made us clean and holy, and the pure linen that you have put on to us. May we come to you humbly, confidently, with joy and with gratitude. We pray that this morning in your name, Jesus. Amen.